I met Thomas Vance on a Tuesday morning in August when he arrived to take over the day-to-day operations of Whitmore Preserve, a 280-acre private nature conservancy about 40 minutes north of the city. I was the outgoing director, and I'd been managing the property for 9 years. My contract was ending, and the board had decided to replace me with someone younger who could handle the physical demands of the work more effectively. Thomas was 42, according to his resume, though he looked older. He had deep lines around his eyes that suggested either sun damage or chronic fatigue, maybe both. We shook hands in the parking lot outside the administrative building. His grip was firm but brief, and he didn't make eye contact. "Welcome to Whitmore," I told him. "You're going to love it here. The land is extraordinary. I've compiled all the maintenance schedules, the seasonal requirements, the vendor contacts. Everything's documented. It's really a straightforward operation once you get the rhythm of it." Thomas nodded. He was looking past me at the building, at the surrounding forest, at the open property beyond. "When does it get dark?" he asked. I thought that was an odd first question, but I answered it. "Around 8:30 this time of year. Why?" "I'm going to need to understand the sunset patterns," he said, "and the light levels at different times. I want to do some of my work during the evening hours. The board approved that when they hired me." "What kind of work needs to be done at night?" I asked. He turned to look at me directly for the first time. "The kind that's better done when there's no one around," he said. I'm going to be handling some of the trail maintenance, and I prefer to work when the property is closed to the public. Nights work better for that." This seemed reasonable enough. Whitmore was open to the public during daylight hours. We ran a visitor center and maintained marked trails through the forest. Some maintenance work, particularly on trails and structures, would be less disruptive if done after hours. Still, there was something about the way he said it that created a small note of unease in my mind, a sense that he wasn't being entirely forthright about his reasons. But I was leaving. He was taking over. If he wanted to work nights, that was his choice. I spent the next 5 days showing him around. I introduced him to the small staff, a part-time naturalist named Iris, a maintenance technician named Raymond, and a part-time administrative assistant named Kim. I showed him the equipment storage, the trails, the visitor facilities. I walked him through the administrative systems and the maintenance protocols. Thomas was attentive during all of this. He asked specific questions about the condition of various structures, about the wildlife patterns, about the visitor demographics, but he didn't ask many personal questions about me, and he didn't volunteer much information about himself. By the second day, I'd stopped trying to engage him in casual conversation. On Friday evening, my last evening at Whitmore, Thomas asked to walk the property with me. It was unusual. He hadn't sought out my company until that point. But I agreed. We walked one of the main trails, the one that wound through the old growth forest section. Is the area that most visitors came to see. The light was starting to shift toward golden, and the shadows between the trees were deepening. The forest smelled like it always did in late summer, like rich earth and decomposing leaves and living things. The previous director before me stayed for 11 years, I told him as we walked. Before that, there was someone who lasted about 4 years. The board likes to transition directors every few years. It keeps the organization fresh, prevents people from getting too territorial about the place. Did they leave willingly? Thomas asked. What? The previous directors, did they leave because they wanted to or because the board pushed them out? I thought about this. A little of both, probably. The previous director, Margaret, she was burned out. She wanted to move closer to her family. The one before that, I don't know exactly what happened. He left kind of abruptly. I got the impression there was some kind of conflict with the board. Thomas was quiet for a while as we walked. The forest was very still. I could hear our footsteps on the path and the occasional bird call, but mostly it was quiet. "Do you like working here?" he asked. "I do," I said. "It's a beautiful property and the work is meaningful, but it's also isolating. You're out here a lot by yourself, dealing with problems that are often just you and nature and the constraints of the physical world. No corporate structure to hide behind, no other departments to shift responsibility to. You're responsible for everything. The condition of every trail, every structure, every decision about how to manage the forest." "Does that bother you?" Thomas asked. Sometimes," I said. "Lately, yes. I think that's why the board's decision to replace me feels okay. I'm ready to step back. I'm ready for the responsibility to be someone else's." Thomas nodded slowly, and we finished the walk without talking much. When we returned to the parking lot, he thanked me for the orientation. He didn't say anything specific about the future or about staying in touch. He just got in his truck and drove away. I left Whitmore on Saturday morning. I packed up the last of my personal items from the office and drove back to the city. I'd been offered a consulting position with a different nonprofit, one that was less hands-on and would let me work primarily from home. It felt like the right transition. I was ready for a change. 3 weeks later, I got an email from Iris, the part-time naturalist. Niche of the subject line was just questions about Thomas, and the body was brief. "He's doing something with the trails at night. Raymond found evidence of work being done. New markers, redirects in some places. But when Raymond asked Thomas about it, he just said it was maintenance and changed the subject. Is this normal? I'm a little concerned." I called Iris immediately. We talked for about 20 minutes. She explained that Thomas had started coming to the property very early in the morning before sunrise and leaving very late at night. He told the staff that he was working on a long-term project related to trail optimization, but he was vague about the details. What concerned Iris was that he seemed to be actively discouraging the public from using certain sections of the trails. He'd removed some of the trail markers that guided visitors along the main routes and had put up new markers that redirected foot traffic toward other areas. "Has he explained why?" I asked. "No," Iris said. And when I asked him directly, he got defensive. He said it was part of his long-term vision for the property and that the board had approved it. But we can't find any documentation about it. Kim checked the board meeting minutes, and there's no mention of trail redirects. This was odd, but it wasn't necessarily alarming. Maybe Thomas had approval for the project and hadn't documented it properly. Maybe the board had given him latitude to make decisions without formal approval. I told Iris that she should reach out to the board directly if she had concerns about his management decisions. It wasn't really my responsibility anymore. But I couldn't quite let it go. I found myself thinking about Thomas, about his odd questions, about his insistence on working nights, about his vague responses to straightforward questions. There was something about his behavior that suggested he had a specific agenda for the property, and that agenda wasn't something he wanted to explain or defend. But again, it wasn't my responsibility. He was the director now. If the board and the staff had issues with his management style, they would address it. 2 weeks later, I got another email from Iris. This one was more urgent. "People are getting lost on the trails," it read. 3 separate incidents in the past 10 days. The people who got lost all said they were following the new trail markers that Thomas put up, but the markers led them in circles or to dead ends. One group had to be rescued by fire and rescue. The board is starting to ask questions. I called Iris again. She was clearly anxious. She told me that the incidents had prompted the board to request an explanation from Thomas about the trail changes. He'd apparently given them some kind of presentation about ecosystem restoration and visitor management, but his explanations were confusing and didn't quite match the actual changes he'd made. The board was concerned about liability. People were getting injured, or at minimum, they were having bad experiences. "Did they ask him to revert the changes?" I asked. "Yes," Iris said. "He said he would, but then he didn't, or he said he was going to do it gradually as part of a longer-term plan. No one's entirely sure what he said because he talks in circles. You ask him a direct question, and his answer is never actually an answer. It's always some kind of explanation that leads somewhere else." I decided to drive back out to Whitmore and see the situation for myself. I told myself this was just me being thorough about a transition I'd managed. In reality, I was genuinely curious about what Thomas was doing, and I was becoming concerned about his behavior. The fact that he wouldn't give straight answers about his work was a significant red flag. It was mid-afternoon when I arrived at Whitmore. The parking lot had a handful of vehicles, some visitors probably, and what I recognized as Raymond's truck. I went into the visitor center, where I found Kim working at the front desk. She looked surprised to see me. "Hi," she said with what seemed like genuine relief. "How are you? What brings you back?" "Just checking in," I said. He wanted to see how things are going with Thomas. Kim's expression became guarded. "He's fine, busy. He's been very focused on the trail work." "I heard there were some incidents with the redirected trails," I said. "Yeah," Kim said quietly. "People got lost. But I think Thomas is working on fixing that. He's supposed to be reverting some of the changes." "Supposed to be?" I asked. "Well, he said he would, but honestly, nobody's really sure what his timeline is. He doesn't communicate a lot. He mostly just comes in early, works on the trails, and leaves late." "During the day?" I asked. "Sometimes," Kim said, "but mostly at night, I think, or early morning. I'm only here during business hours, so I don't see him that much." I thanked Kim and went back outside. I took one of the trail maps from the visitor center and started walking one of the routes that Iris had mentioned. I wanted to see what Thomas had done with the trail markers. The main loop trail was in the old growth section. I'd walked it hundreds of times over the past 9 years. The forest there was beautiful, towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks, a thick understory of salal and ferns, a sense of age and stillness that most people found meditative. The original trail markers were standard metal blazes nailed to trees, painted with reflective paint, so they were visible even in low light. You could follow them easily. As I walked, I started noticing the new markers that Thomas had put up. At first, they seemed to supplement the original markers, additional directional signs to clarify the route. But the further I walked, or the more the new markers diverged from the original trail. They started pointing me in different directions toward areas that weren't part of the established loop. I followed one branch that led to a dead end at a stream bed. Another branch looped back on itself several times before eventually connecting back to the main trail. It was as if Thomas had deliberately redesigned the trail system to be confusing. I retraced my steps and tried another route. This one led toward the back section of the property, an area that was supposed to be closed to the public. The original trail markers wouldn't take you there. That area was reserved for wildlife habitat management and didn't have maintained trails. But Thomas's new markers led directly into it. I followed the markers for a while, pushing through undergrowth and stepping over fallen logs. The forest got thicker and more difficult to navigate. I was starting to feel genuinely lost, which is unusual for someone who has spent 9 years managing this property. I know the landscape intimately. I can navigate through the forest without any markers. But the way Thomas had set up his trail system, it made me doubt my own sense of direction. After about 30 minutes of this, I turned around and headed back. I was uncomfortable with what I was seeing. I couldn't articulate exactly why his trail redirection bothered me so much. Objectively, it was just trail markers. They could be removed. People could be informed of the changes. There was nothing genuinely threatening about it. But the deliberate nature of the confusion, the way the markers led people in circles and to dead ends, in the way Thomas wouldn't give a straight explanation for why he was doing it, all of this added up to something that felt intentionally deceptive. I went back to the visitor center and asked for the board president's phone number. Kim looked uncomfortable but provided it. I called Rebecca Sherman, the board president, from my car in the parking lot. She seemed surprised to hear from me but willing to talk. I heard there have been some issues with the trail changes Thomas made, I said. Yes, Rebecca said carefully. We're working through it. Thomas says he has a longer-term vision for the property, but we've asked him to revert the immediate changes and go through a proper planning process before making more modifications. Did he explain his reasoning? I asked. Not really, Rebecca said. He said something about wanting to manage visitor access and encourage people to use less trafficked areas. But his explanation didn't quite make sense with what he actually did. It seemed more like he was trying to actively confuse people rather than redirect them. Has anyone asked him why he's working at night? I asked. There was a pause. How did you know he's working at night? Rebecca asked. I didn't specifically know, I admitted, but he mentioned it to me when he first arrived, and now people are saying he's working early mornings and late nights. I'm just wondering if there's a connection between the night work and the trail confusion. That's a good question, Rebecca said. I don't think anyone's asked him about that directly. We've been focused on getting him to fix the immediate problem. But you're right. It is odd that he's so focused on night work. I suggested that the board ask Thomas for a full explanation of his project, including why he prefers to work nights. Rebecca said she would do that. I told her I was concerned about his behavior and that they should probably do some background verification before letting him make any more major changes to the property. After we hung up, I drove back to the city. I was feeling strange about the whole situation. I couldn't shake the sense that Thomas was doing something deliberate and intentional, but I couldn't articulate what that something was or why it mattered. Over the next few weeks, I heard from Iris periodically. Thomas had allegedly reverted the trail markers, but he was being slow about it. He'd also given some kind of explanation to the board about his work, though the details were vague and no one was particularly satisfied. But the board seemed to have decided that this was a management style difference and that they would give him more time to settle in. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. It wasn't my responsibility. I had a new job. I was moving on. But I couldn't quite shake it. I started doing some research on my own. I looked up Thomas Vance online, trying to find his professional history. What I found was frustratingly vague. He had a LinkedIn profile that listed various management and land conservation positions, but the dates didn't quite add up. There were gaps in his employment history that suggested either unemployment or positions that weren't represented on his profile. Yeah, I couldn't find any references to why he'd left previous positions or what his actual track record was. I decided to call the previous conservation organization where Thomas had supposedly worked. I told them I was doing a background check as a board member of a nonprofit hiring someone who'd previously worked for them. The person I spoke to was cautious, but eventually admitted that Thomas had worked there for about a year and a half, and that he'd left on what they described as mutual agreement. When I asked what that meant, they said they couldn't discuss it further without his permission. But their tone suggested that the departure had not been entirely positive. I called Rebecca Sherman back and told her what I'd found. I explained that Thomas's employment history didn't quite add up and that his previous employer seemed reluctant to discuss his departure. I recommended that the board do a more thorough background check before giving him more autonomy. Rebecca thanked me for the information but seemed less concerned than I would have expected. "We've hired him now," she said. "He's got a contract. We're going to work with him and see how things develop. If there are real issues, we'll address them." I accepted this response, though I was disappointed that the board wasn't taking the warning more seriously. I told myself that I'd done what I could. It was their decision now. 3 months passed. I didn't hear much about Whitmore during that time. In October, and I got a brief email from Iris saying that Thomas had settled into the job and that things seemed fine. The trail issues had been resolved. He was still working odd hours, but it wasn't affecting the day-to-day operations. Everything seemed to be functioning normally. Then, in early November, I got a call from Rebecca Sherman. Her voice sounded tight, stressed. "Something strange is happening at the property," she said without preamble. "I wanted to ask you about it because you might be able to help us understand what's going on." "What kind of something?" I asked. "Visitors are reporting strange things on the trails," Rebecca said. "They're seeing what they're describing as new trails that aren't on our official maps. And when they try to follow these trails, they end up in areas they don't recognize. Some people are getting genuinely lost. We're getting complaints, and now we're getting inquiries from the fire department." "Did you ask Thomas about it?" I asked. "Yes," Rebecca said. "He says he doesn't know anything about new trails. He says he's maintaining the existing trail system and hasn't made any modifications beyond what he already discussed. But he's also been very resistant to our requests to document what he's been doing at night. He says his night work is part of the job and doesn't require additional documentation." I felt a chill run through me. "Are you saying there are trails on the property that Thomas didn't create?" "I'm saying I don't know," Rebecca said. "That's why I'm calling you. You know the property well. Is it possible that there are older trails from before the property was a conservancy, that people are accidentally discovering?" I thought about this. It was theoretically possible. The property had been used for logging and farming before it was converted to a conservancy. There could be old roads or paths that were still partially visible through the forest. But the descriptions that Rebecca was giving me, visitors finding completely new trails that weren't there a few months ago, didn't match with people accidentally discovering old paths. I don't think that's what's happening, I told Rebecca. When I was there a few months ago, Thomas was actively creating confusion in the trail system. He wasn't reverting everything like he said he was. It's possible that he's continued creating new trails, or that he's manipulated the existing trail system in ways that are making people think there are new trails. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Why would he do that? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. That's what's strange about it. I've never understood his motivation. Do you think we should investigate? Rebecca asked. Do you think there's something seriously wrong here? I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her that it was probably just a management style difference, and that she should work it out with Thomas directly. But I couldn't quite say that because I didn't believe it. I think you should talk to him directly, I said. Ask him specifically what he's doing at night. Don't let him give you vague answers, and make him explain exactly what work he's doing and why. Rebecca said she would do that. She thanked me for the information and hung up. I didn't hear anything more for about 2 weeks. Then, in late November, I got an email from Iris with no subject line. The body of the email said only, "Can you call me?" Not email. I called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear anxiety in her voice. He's gone, she said without preamble. What do you mean, he's gone? Thomas. He didn't show up for work 3 days ago. The board is trying to figure out what to do. They're thinking about filing a missing person report, but they're also wondering if he just quit and didn't tell anyone. Nobody knows. And there's something else. What? I asked. The trails are different again, Iris said. New markers, new redirects, and all the work he supposedly reverted. It's back. And there are sections of the forest that are now blocked off with tape and signs that say, ecological restoration in progress. But nobody authorized that. The board has no record of approving it. When did he do this work? I asked. We don't know, Iris said. It was done at night. Nobody was there to see it. It must have been done since he stopped coming in for his regular shifts. I was trying to process this information. Did anyone try to follow the new trails? I asked. No, Iris said. After the earlier incidents with people getting lost, everyone's scared of the new trails, but people are reporting them. Visitors are seeing the markers and the blocked off areas, and it's creating confusion. Even the board is concerned about liability again. Did the board try to contact Thomas? I asked. His phone's disconnected, Iris said. His house, he rented a place nearby. The landlord says he hasn't been there in days, but his truck is still parked at the property. It's been there since the morning before he stopped showing up for work. This was genuinely alarming. A person doesn't just disappear with their truck still parked at their workplace, unless something happened to him, or unless he deliberately left the truck there as a cover to go somewhere else. Did anyone check if he's okay? I asked. Did anyone go to his house or call the police? The board is trying to figure that out, Iris said. But they're also hesitant to escalate. They're worried about it getting to the media and causing bad press for the organization. You know how it is. Any story about a nonprofit having management issues gets picked up by local news, and suddenly people are questioning whether the organization is functional. That's ridiculous, I said. A person is potentially missing. That's more important than PR concerns. I know, Iris said. That's why I'm calling you. I wanted to ask your advice on what to do. Should I go to the police myself if the board won't? Should I reach out to the media? I don't want to betray the organization, but something is wrong here. and I think people need to know. I told Iris that she should probably start by calling the local police non-emergency line and reporting that Thomas was missing. She could frame it as an employee wellness check. She was concerned about a colleague who hadn't shown up for work and wasn't answering his phone. It's the police could investigate without the board's permission. Iris said she would do that. After we hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about Thomas, his strange insistence on working nights, his vague explanations about his work, his deliberate creation of confusing trail systems, his disappearance, his truck left at the property. It all added up to something, but I couldn't figure out what. I decided to drive back to Whitmore and look at the property myself. I wanted to see what the new trails looked like. I wanted to understand what he'd been doing. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The property was quieter than I'd ever seen it. Only a few vehicles were in the parking lot. The visitor center was still open, but there was a small sign on the information board that said, "Closed for facility assessment." Yeah, please check back later. I went into the center. Kim was working the desk, and she looked stressed. "Hi," I said. "I heard Thomas is missing." Kim nodded. "Yeah, the police came by this morning to look at his truck and ask some questions. They said they filed a missing person report. The board is saying we should close the property for a few days while we figure out what's going on." "Can I walk the trails?" I asked. "I want to see what the new markers look like." Kim hesitated. "Officially, the property is supposed to be closed to the public," she said. "But you're not really public. I guess it's fine." I took a trail map and headed out to the forest. It was late afternoon, and the light was already starting to shift toward evening. The air was cool and damp. The forest smelled like rain and decay. The first thing I noticed was that the new trail markers were not subtle. They were bright orange and blue, much more visible than the original markers. They were placed frequently, almost too frequently, making it impossible to miss them. They clearly marked several trails that I didn't recognize. I followed one of the new trails. It wound through the forest in a way that didn't match the natural topography. A normal trail follows the contours of the land, avoiding steep sections and navigating around natural obstacles. But Thomas's trails seemed deliberately designed to go in unexpected directions. They would switch back for no apparent reason. They would lead through dense undergrowth when there were clearer routes nearby. They seemed designed to confuse rather than to guide. After about 20 minutes of following the trail, I reached an area of the property that I recognized as the back section, the area that was supposed to be closed to the public. There was a clearing there, maybe 50 feet across, completely surrounded by forest. I'd never seen this clearing before. I didn't remember it from my 9 years of managing the property, but more than that, I realized that I recognized the clearing from somewhere else. The configuration of the trees, the way the clearing opened up in the middle of the forest, the small stream that ran through it. I'd seen this place before. I'd seen it in an old photograph, a historical photograph. From before, the property was a conservancy. I stood in the clearing for a long time, trying to place the memory, and then it came to me. There had been a building in this clearing, an old structure. It was in a photograph from the 1970s, part of the historical documentation I'd reviewed when I first started as director of the conservancy. The structure had been demolished, the board had told me. There was nothing left of it now. But standing in the clearing, looking at the pattern of the trees, I could see where the building might have been. There were subtle marks on the ground, slight depressions in the forest floor that could have been the foundation of a structure. And there was something else. There was a rectangular area about the size of a small room where the undergrowth was different. The ground cover was different. It was as if something had been disturbed and recently replanted. I took several photographs with my phone. I didn't know if they would show anything, but I felt like I needed to document what I was seeing. I walked back to the parking lot in the gathering dusk. By the time I reached the visitor center, it was almost dark. Kim was closing up. She looked at me with concern. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I don't know what I'm looking for," I admitted. I drove back to the city, and I spent the evening looking at the historical documentation about the property that I had in my files. The photograph I was thinking of was from 1978. It showed a structure in the forest that the caption identified only as Old Conservation House, 1978. There was no further information about what the building was used for or what had happened to it. I called Rebecca Sherman and asked her about it. She said she would look into the property history and get back to me. The next morning, Rebecca called. She'd spoken to the board's historian, a retired professor named Dr. Patricia Chen, who had been instrumental in acquiring the property for the Conservancy. According to Patricia, the structure in the photograph had been used as a field research station for a short period in the late 1970s. Some kind of biological research, Patricia thought. But the building had become unstable, and the board had decided to demolish it and restore the area as wildlife habitat. Did anyone use it for research after 1978? I asked. Not officially, Rebecca said. The building was demolished in 1985. But there were rumors, I guess, that it was used by someone after it was supposed to be closed. Some kind of unauthorized research or activity. But there's no documentation of that. And it was a long time ago. Why? I found evidence that someone has been working in that area recently, I told her. There's disturbed ground where the building used to be, and Thomas seems to have deliberately created a trail system that leads to that clearing. There was a pause. What are you suggesting? Rebecca asked carefully. I'm not suggesting anything, I said. I'm just pointing out that Thomas's entire project seems to have been focused on that specific area of the property. The trail markers all lead toward it. The blocked off areas are around it, and then he disappeared. Rebecca said she would bring this information to the board. She thanked me for the investigation and said they would decide what to do next. I hung up and sat with my thoughts. Something about the whole situation was wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The deliberate creation of confusing trails, the focus on the area where an old building used to stand. It's Thomas's insistence on working at night, his refusal to explain his activities, his sudden disappearance, leaving his truck behind. But missing was just a possibility at this point. Maybe Thomas had decided to leave and had walked out or caught a ride from someone. Maybe the whole situation was just a misunderstanding and he would turn up with a reasonable explanation. I told myself to stop speculating and let the situation play out. But 3 weeks later, in early December, the situation did play out. And it played out in a way that I wasn't prepared for. The police found Thomas Vance's body in the forest. He was discovered about 200 meters off the trail system, in an area of dense forest that was rarely visited. The local news reported that he appeared to have died from a fall, and he'd hit his head on a rock and apparently lost consciousness. Based on the decomposition, he'd been there for at least 3 weeks. The police investigation found nothing suspicious. The conclusion was that Thomas had gone into the forest for some reason, lost his footing, fallen, and been fatally injured. It was the kind of accident that happens in rural areas. Tragic, but not uncommon, but I couldn't make sense of it. Thomas had been working in that forest for months. He knew the terrain. He wouldn't just randomly wander into dense forest and fall on a rock. Unless he was deliberately avoiding the trail system, deliberately going into an area that he knew was dangerous. And then there was the question of what he'd been doing at the property that night. What was his purpose in being in that particular area? What was he looking for? And I called Iris and asked her if the police had found anything in Thomas's personal effects or his truck that might explain what he was doing. They found nothing, Iris said. His truck was clean. No personal items, no notes, no indication of what he was working on. The board hired someone to go through his work files, but there's almost nothing there. He didn't keep records of his activities. He didn't maintain a work journal. It's like he deliberately left no trace of what he was doing. What about his phone? I asked. Did the police recover his phone? They didn't find it at the property, Iris said. The board's assuming it was in his possession when he died, and it might be buried in the forest somewhere. Or it could have been damaged and lost over time. I was quiet for a moment. Do you think he was doing something illegal? I asked. I don't know, Iris said. The board is satisfied with the police investigation. They're closing the book on it and planning to hire a new director. But I'm not satisfied. I don't think we understand what he was doing at the property, and I don't think we understand how he died. I agreed with her. There was too much that didn't make sense. But short of initiating my own investigation, I wasn't sure what I could do about it. I went back to the property one more time in mid-December. I wanted to see if the trail markers were still there, or if they'd been removed. I wanted to walk to that clearing again and see if there was anything I'd missed. When I arrived, I found the property in a state of partial restoration. Some of the trail markers had been removed. Others remained. Yes, the blocked off areas were still cordoned off, though the signs had been taken down. I walked directly to the clearing where the old building had been. The area looked undisturbed. The ground cover was undisturbed. If there had been any evidence of recent digging or activity, it was no longer visible. I stood in the clearing for a long time, looking at the trees, looking at the ground, trying to understand what Thomas had been doing here. And I realized, standing there in the quiet forest, that I didn't actually want to understand it. Understanding it would mean confronting something about the property that I didn't want to confront. It would mean accepting that something had been happening at Whitmore Preserve that was intentional and deliberate and hidden. I walked back to my car and left the property. I didn't return, or I didn't contact the board again. I let the situation fade into my past, but I never forgot what I found in that clearing. I never forgot the photograph of the old building. I never forgot Thomas's refusal to explain why he only worked at night. And I never forgot the fact that his entire focus seemed to be on returning to an area that the board had tried to bury, literally and figuratively, decades ago. Recently, about a year after all of this happened, I received an email from a researcher named Dr. Michael Hayes. He was a biologist who was doing work on historical ecological research sites, and he'd come across a reference to Whitmore Preserve in some old scientific papers. He was trying to track down information about research that was supposedly conducted at the property in the 1970s. In his email, he mentioned that he'd been trying to access the board's historical records, but the board had been uncooperative. He asked if I could help him understand what had been happening at the property. I wrote back and told him that I didn't have any additional information beyond what he probably already knew. But I also told him that if he was interested in the history of the property, he should talk to the board directly, rather than trying to access records without permission. He responded with a longer email in which he explained what he was researching. He said that in the 1970s there had been a series of biological research projects at various conservation properties across the region. Most of these projects were documented and had been completed or discontinued in standard ways. But there was one project at an unidentified location, that seemed to have been deliberately hidden or obscured from the historical record. The references to it existed only in personal correspondence and in footnotes of other papers. The actual research site had never been clearly identified, and any records of the research had apparently been destroyed or archived in a way that made them inaccessible. Based on the information available, Dr. Hayes believed this unidentified site might have been Whitmore Preserve. If that was the case, he wanted to understand what kind of research had been conducted and why it had been hidden. I didn't respond to that email. I felt like responding would be opening a door that I deliberately closed, and I wasn't ready to reopen it. But I've thought about Dr. Hayes's research. I've thought about the old photograph of the building. I've thought about Thomas Vance and his deliberate focus on that clearing in the forest. And I've developed a theory, though I have no evidence to support it. I think that Thomas knew what kind of research had been conducted at that clearing. I think he was deliberately trying to find evidence of it or to uncover something that had been hidden. I think his trail system, confusing as it was designed to lead to that specific location. I think he went into the forest at night to avoid being seen, and I think he died because he was deliberately going to a place that was dangerous, a place he was trying to reach for some specific purpose that he was unwilling to explain. And I think the reason he refused to explain his work, the reason he insisted on working at night, the reason he was evasive and vague about his activities, was that he was investigating something that the board didn't want investigated, something that had been deliberately hidden decades ago and was supposed to remain hidden. I'll probably never know for certain what Thomas was doing or why he died, but I know that something about Whitmore Preserve is not what it appears to be. Something happened there in the 1970s that was significant enough to be hidden from the historical record, and someone, Thomas Vance, was looking for evidence of it and died in the process. Sometimes when I think about the clearing in the forest, I wonder if there's anything still there. I wonder if evidence of that old research is still buried beneath the forest floor, waiting for someone else to find it. And I wonder how many other people have tried to uncover that evidence before Thomas, and how many will try after. But I don't go back to Whitmore Preserve. I don't want to know. I think about Thomas Vance sometimes and feel something that's part sadness and part gratitude. Sadness that he died, and gratitude that I'm not the one who has to answer Dr. Hayes's questions or confront whatever is hidden at that clearing in the forest. The board hired a new director. The property is operating normally again. The confusing trail markers are gone, replaced with clear, straightforward paths that lead visitors through the forest in a logical way. Nothing is hidden anymore, or at least nothing is deliberately made confusing. But I know that the clearing is still there. The old building is still gone, demolished decades ago. But whatever happened there, whatever research was conducted, whatever secrets were buried beneath the forest floor, those things remain. And occasionally, I wonder if someone else will arrive at Whitmore Preserve. Someone like Thomas Vance, someone determined to understand what's hidden. And I wonder what they'll find, and what will happen to them when they do. I think about Thomas's strange insistence on working at night, and I think I finally understand why. He wasn't trying to hide his activities from the staff or from the board. He was trying to hide them from the forest itself. Or maybe not hide them from the forest, but conduct them in a way that minimized his presence in that clearing during daylight hours. Maybe he was trying to do his work and leave as little evidence as possible. Maybe he was trying to avoid being observed, not by people, but by something else. I don't know what that something else might be. I don't want to speculate, but standing in that clearing, I felt something that I've never been able to quite articulate. It was a sense of being watched, even though there was no one there. It was a sense that the forest knew what was happening, knew that someone was looking for something that wasn't supposed to be found. And I think Thomas Vance died because he continued looking despite that warning. He died because he was determined to understand what had been hidden, and the forest, or whatever is hidden in the forest, decided that he should remain hidden as well.